Sarah Whitmore had exactly $40 in her bank account and a mother who needed her medicine refilled by Friday. So when the black SUV came spinning across the ice toward a row of parked cars, she didn't think about her own safety at all. She just started running toward the wreck before her brain even caught up with her feet. And by the time she stopped running, her whole life had already quietly changed direction without asking her permission. If you like stories where a small act of kindness ends up changing everything, hit subscribe and tap that like button right now. Winter Vale has a lot more of these waiting for you. And trust me, you don't want to miss how this one ends. Winter has always felt like a season of quiet honesty to me. The way snow settles over everything and makes the world look softer than it really is. And while I was writing Sarah's story, I kept thinking about how a single snowfall can either bury you or protect you depending on what you do next. So stay with me to the end, because this one earns its ending. Sarah was 25 years old and had spent her whole life in a small rented house on the edge of Minneapolis with her mother Diane, a woman who used to work two jobs, one at a bakery and one cleaning offices downtown, before her heart condition made standing for long hours impossible and left Sarah to carry most of the household on her own shoulders. She had never met her father, and she'd stopped asking about him around the time she turned 16, when she realized the question only made her mother's eyes go distant and sad. So instead, she focused on the one thing she could control, which was showing up every single day, doing whatever shift they gave her, and keeping the lights on. The warehouse where she worked belonged to a mid-sized shipping company called Brightpoint Logistics, a sprawling gray building on the outskirts of the city that never seemed to sleep. Its loading docks lit up under sodium lights even at 3 in the morning when the snowplows were still clearing the access road. The whole place smelling permanently of cardboard, cold metal, and the diesel exhaust of idling delivery trucks. Sarah had been there for almost 2 years, mostly on the packing line, and she'd learned early on that the safest way to survive a place like that was to keep her head down, do her hours, and never get pulled into the gossip that spread through the break room like a bad cold. That week, though, the gossip wasn't the kind you could avoid, because management had discovered a pattern of missing electronics, expensive items that were scanned out under duplicate barcodes and never made it onto the delivery trucks, worth what someone estimated was close to $80,000 over just a few months. And the floor manager, a heavy-set man named Roger Blake, was furious about it in a way that made everyone flinch when he walked past. Roger called a meeting on the floor and told everyone that whoever confessed by the end of the week would be treated leniently, but whoever got caught lying would be prosecuted. And he said it while staring at different people like he was trying to read guilt off their faces, which only made the whole room tense and suspicious of each other. Sarah's closest friend at the warehouse, a woman named Priya, who worked 2 stations down and always saved her a seat at lunch, leaned over that afternoon and whispered that half the floor was already pointing fingers at each other, and that Sarah should be careful, because Roger seemed to be looking for someone easy to blame rather than someone who was actually guilty. Sarah told her not to worry, that she had nothing to hide and nothing to fear, but Priya squeezed her arm anyway and said that being innocent had never stopped a man like Roger from needing a name to hand his own bosses, especially with corporate breathing down his neck about the losses, and something about the way she said it stayed with Sarah longer than she wanted it to. Sarah wasn't worried, not really, because she knew she hadn't touched a single barcode scanner that didn't belong to her own station, and she figured the truth would come out on its own the way it usually did. So she went home that night and made her mother a bowl of soup like she always did, the kitchen window frosted over with the first real snowfall of the season. She stood there for a second with the spoon in her hand, watching the snow pile up on the windowsill in small, quiet drifts, and something about it made her feel calmer than she had all day, like the world was being wiped clean whether it wanted to be or not. A fresh, unmarked page laid down over everything that had gone wrong that week, and then she went to bed early because her body simply couldn't stay upright any longer. The next morning, she woke before her alarm, the way she always did in winter, and caught the 6:15 bus into the industrial district with her coat collar pulled up against a wind that cut straight through the fabric, her breath fogging the window as she watched the streetlights blur past one by one. She had a strange, itchy feeling in her chest the whole ride, the kind of feeling that comes right before something happens, though she told herself it was just nerves about the investigation, and she watched the plows scrape the main road clear while side streets stayed buried under a thin crust of packed snow. And when the bus let her off 2 blocks from the warehouse, she started walking fast, head down against the cold, trying to beat the clock. That was when she heard the screech of tires behind her and turned just in time to see a black SUV fishtailing wildly across the icy intersection, its driver clearly losing control, the vehicle sliding almost gracefully at first before it caught the curb wrong. And before she could process what was happening, it slammed into a tree at the edge of the parking lot with a crunch that seemed to shake the whole street. Sarah didn't remember deciding to run toward it. Her legs simply carried her there, while snow kicked up from the branches overhead and settled across the crumpled hood like a strange, silent blanket over the wreckage. And she dialed 911 with shaking fingers even as she pulled at the driver's door, which wouldn't budge. The street was empty, the kind of empty only a winter morning in an industrial district can be. So she ran to the back of the SUV, popped the trunk, and found a golf club with a heavy metal head, and she used it to smash out one of the rear windows, wincing at the cold sting of shattered glass against her wrist as she reached through to unlock the door from the inside. Once she got the door open, she saw him clearly for the first time. A man who looked to be in his mid-30s, dark hair falling across his forehead, a strong jaw dusted with stubble, and gray-blue eyes that fluttered half open when she called out to him. Wearing an expensive charcoal wool coat that was now soaked through with something dark near the collar, and his breathing was shallow and uneven in a way that scared her more than the crash itself. She loosened the scarf around his neck and noticed blood matting through his dark hair from a gash near his temple, and without thinking twice, she packed snow into her own knit hat and pressed it gently against the wound, her hands steady even though her heart was hammering, because some instinct told her that panicking would only cost him time. She eased him out of the driver's seat as carefully as she could, supporting his neck and shoulders the way she'd once seen in a first aid video her mother made her watch years ago, and laid him on his side in the fresh snow so he wouldn't choke, packing more of it gently under his head as a makeshift pillow, murmuring quietly that help was coming, that he just needed to hold on a little longer. She kept talking to him the whole time, telling him her name was Sarah, that he was going to be fine, that he just needed to keep breathing, even though she had no idea if he could hear a word of it. And at one point his eyes fluttered halfway open and focused on her for a second before sliding shut again, which somehow felt like the longest and most important moment of her entire morning. By the time the ambulance arrived, sirens cutting through the gray morning light, Sarah was kneeling beside a stranger in the snow with blood on her hands and half her breakfast still in her stomach from nerves. And when the paramedics loaded him in, she noticed his phone lying on the passenger seat and grabbed it out of instinct, thinking someone would need to reach his family. She climbed into the ambulance without a second thought and rode with him to the hospital, answering the EMT's questions as clearly as she could while they cut open his coat and hooked him to monitors that beeped in a rhythm she found herself praying wouldn't change. And it wasn't until she was sitting in a hard plastic chair in the emergency waiting room, having handed the phone off to a nurse, that she remembered she was supposed to be at work 40 minutes ago. Her own phone buzzed in her coat pocket and she answered it quickly, saying she was on her way. But the voice on the other end wasn't sympathetic at all. It was a coworker named Kevin Ross, someone she'd barely exchanged more than a few words with over 2 years, and his tone was ice cold as he said he never expected this from her, that this explained why she'd always been so quiet, that she was the thief they'd been looking for. Sarah felt the floor tilt under her. She said that wasn't true, that she could explain everything. But Kevin cut her off and asked why she hadn't shown up then, why she'd suddenly gone silent right when the investigation was closing in. And when he hung up, she sat there gripping the phone so hard her knuckles went white, terrified of what was waiting for her. She spent the last of her cash on a cab to get back to the warehouse as fast as possible. And when she walked through the doors, the entire floor went quiet, dozens of eyes turning toward her like she'd already been convicted, and she pushed past all of it straight to Roger Blake's office, only to find the investigation had already wrapped up without her. Roger's face was hard as he told her that several employees had reported suspicious behavior from her over the past few weeks, and that showing up late on the exact day they were closing the case only confirmed what everyone already suspected, and he said the company was starting her termination paperwork effective immediately. Sarah asked him flatly who exactly had reported her, and Roger just shook his head and said that wasn't information he was required to share, And when she pointed out that she'd called an ambulance and ridden with a dying man to the hospital instead of clocking in, he waved a hand like the detail bored him and told her that plenty of people had convenient excuses when they got caught. Sarah tried to explain again, her voice cracking as she described the crash, the ice, the tree, the man bleeding in the snow while she waited alone on an empty street for help to arrive. But nobody in that office looked like they believed a word of it. And when she pulled out her phone to show the 911 call log as proof, one of the other managers actually laughed, a short, ugly sound, and said someone clever enough to fake barcodes was clever enough to fake a story too. Priya tried to speak up for her from the doorway, saying she'd vouch for Sarah's character, that she'd worked beside her for 2 years and never once seen her cut a corner. But Roger cut her off sharply and told her to get back to her station unless she wanted to be written up for insubordination, and Priya backed away with an apologetic look that told Sarah she'd tried and simply couldn't do more. Something in Sarah broke a little at that comment, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because she realized in that moment that no amount of truth was going to matter to these people, and she walked out of the warehouse in a kind of daze, snow starting to fall again outside. Thick, heavy flakes that clung to her eyelashes and blurred the parking lot lights into soft, indifferent halos that felt almost mocking given how the morning had gone. She had no money left for another cab, so she walked the whole way home in the cold, her sneakers soaked through by the time she reached her street, and she kept whispering to herself that there was no point dwelling on it, that she needed to find another job, even as the lump in her throat grew heavier with every block. When she opened the front door, her mother took one look at her face and knew something terrible had happened, and Sarah finally let herself fall apart, sobbing out the whole story while Diane held her hands and listened, her own frail body trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the unfairness of watching her daughter get punished for saving a stranger's life. Diane didn't say much that night. She just made tea and sat with her daughter until the shaking stopped, rubbing slow circles on her back the way she used to when Sarah was small and scared of thunderstorms. And the next morning, Sarah woke up determined not to let her mother see her broken again. So she put on the brightest smile she could manage and made breakfast, joking about finding an even better job by the end of the week. Diane reached across the table and took her hand, telling her she was proud of her no matter what, that the world had a strange way of paying people back for the good they did even when it didn't look like it in the moment. And Sarah smiled and told her not to worry, though privately, she wasn't sure she believed it herself anymore. Later that night, after Diane had gone to bed, Sarah sat by the window watching snow collect on the porch railing and found herself thinking about her father for the first time in years, wondering if he'd ever had a day like this one, a day where doing the right thing cost him everything and nobody around him seemed to care, and whether that was part of why he'd disappeared from her life so completely. She didn't let herself sit with the thought for long. It never led anywhere good. So she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and told herself that whatever had happened to him, she wasn't going to let one bad week turn her into someone who gave up. And eventually the snow outside slowed enough that she could finally fall asleep in the chair. What Sarah didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that the man she'd pulled from the wreckage had just woken up in a private hospital room a few miles away, and that the doctors were explaining to him that he'd suffered a sudden cardiac event behind the wheel, lost control on the ice, and would very likely have died if a stranger hadn't acted as quickly as she did. His name was Adam Sinclair, and he ran a mid-sized investment firm that had quietly become one of the largest private backers of e-commerce logistics companies in the Midwest, including, though he didn't know it yet, the very company that had just fired the woman who saved his life. What almost nobody at his firm knew was that Adam had grown up in a house not so different from Sarah's, raised by a single father who drove a delivery truck through Minnesota winters much like this one, and that Adam had spent years putting himself through law school before ever touching a spreadsheet, a fact he rarely mentioned because it made people treat him differently once they knew. He remembered, lying in that hospital bed, a winter from his own childhood when his father had been laid off 2 days before Christmas over an accusation that later turned out to be false, and how long it had taken his family to recover from that kind of injustice. And something about hearing his own rescuer had just gone through the same thing made his chest tighten in a way the accident itself hadn't managed to do. When Adam heard how close he'd come to dying alone in the snow, he sat in silence for a long moment before asking his assistant, a sharp young man named Grant Powell, to find out everything he could about the woman who'd called for help. saying simply that he owed her his life and he intended to do something about it. Grant went back to the hospital staff first and learned that a young woman had ridden in with the ambulance, handed off Adam's phone to a nurse, and then left in a taxi. And following that thread, he started asking around near the hospital until a cab driver remembered picking someone up that morning, a woman with blood still on her hands, heading toward an industrial warehouse. The cab driver told Grant the woman had looked shaken, wiping her hands with a fast food napkin the whole ride, and had barely said a word except to ask him to hurry. And Grant thanked him and drove straight to the warehouse district himself instead of sending someone else, feeling oddly invested in finding this stranger for reasons he couldn't quite explain to Adam over the phone. It didn't take Grant long after that to track down Sarah's name and address. And when he reported back to Adam, mentioning almost as an afterthought that the warehouse in question had fired her that same day for supposedly being involved in a theft ring, Adam sat up straighter in the hospital bed, his expression darkening in a way Grant hadn't seen from him before. Grant said carefully that nobody at the warehouse had wanted to talk much once they realized who was asking, most of them assuming he was some kind of corporate auditor sent to dig for more people to blame. And that one young woman there, someone named Priya, had pulled him aside in the parking lot to say that Sarah was being blamed unfairly and that everyone on the floor knew it, but nobody dared say so out loud where Roger could hear. Adam asked the doctor when he could be discharged, and when the doctor said he needed another day of observation, Adam simply nodded and said he'd wait, but that Grant should keep digging, because something about the timing of her firing, right after she'd spent her morning saving a stranger instead of clocking in, didn't sit right with him at all, and he wasn't the kind of man who let things that didn't sit right with him go unanswered. Meanwhile, Sarah spent that day walking from store to store in the city center looking for any kind of work, but nobody was hiring in the middle of winter, and by the time she got home her feet were numb and her spirits were lower than she wanted to admit. So she sold her phone at a pawn shop for less than half of what it was worth, just to have enough cash to get by for a few more days. The next afternoon, as she walked up to her own front door, she heard voices coming from inside the house and froze for a second before pushing it open. And there in her small living room sat her mother, calm but clearly stunned, along with a man Sarah recognized instantly, even though she'd only seen him unconscious and bleeding in the snow. Adam stood up when he saw her, a small bandage still visible near his temple where the stitches had gone in, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the tension in the room thick enough to touch, until he finally spoke, his voice quieter than she expected from someone who ran a firm worth hundreds of millions of dollars, saying simply that he'd come to thank her for saving his life. Sarah felt her whole body go warm and cold at once, staring at him standing there in her cramped little living room in a coat that probably cost more than her rent for the entire year, and she managed to ask how he was feeling, genuinely relieved to see him upright and breathing on his own after everything she'd witnessed on that icy road. Adam told her he was recovering well, that the doctors had cleared him to make this visit even though he suspected he'd rushed them a little. And then his expression turned more serious as he said he'd also learned what happened to her at work because of him, and that it wasn't something he intended to simply let go. Sarah shrugged and said it was fine, that these things happen, but Adam shook his head firmly and told her that it wasn't fine at all, that from what his team had found, her employer hadn't just treated her unjustly, they'd likely violated several labor protections in the process, and that as it happened, he had a background in corporate law before he ever went into investing. Grant, standing near the doorway, added that Adam had built his early career representing exactly these kinds of cases before moving into finance, and that once he'd seen the details of what Brightpoint had done, he wasn't going to be able to simply walk away from it, whether Sarah wanted his help or not. Diane and Sarah exchanged a look of disbelief, and Diane finally admitted, quietly, that they didn't have anywhere near the money it would take to fight a company like that in court, but Adam cut in before she could finish, saying that money wasn't the issue, that Sarah had saved his life without asking for anything in return, and the least he could do was make sure she didn't lose everything for it. Sarah hesitated, and used to accepting help from anyone, let alone a stranger who happened to be worth more money than she could imagine. But something about the steady way Adam looked at her made it hard to say no, and eventually she agreed, still half convinced she was dreaming the whole thing. Before he left, Grant handed her a plain envelope and told her, gently but firmly, not to take another job just yet, to give them time to sort things out properly, and used the break to rest, and Sarah took it with trembling hands, later finding enough cash inside to cover a month of bills and her mother's next round of medication, murmuring her thanks. Feeling for the first time in days like she could breathe without something crushing her chest. The weeks that followed felt almost unreal. Adam kept up with his medical appointments while quietly having his legal team dig deeper into Brightpoint's practices, and Sarah and her mother finally had a stretch of days where they weren't scrambling just to get by, cooking real dinners together instead of whatever was cheapest, snow falling steadily outside their window like the whole city had decided to slow down with them. Sarah bought her phone back from the pawn shop the moment she had a little cash again, mostly so Adam's office could reach her. And there was something strange and warm building in her chest every time his name showed up on the screen, a feeling she hadn't let herself examine too closely yet. Then one afternoon the call came that changed everything again. Adam explaining that the owners of Brightpoint's parent company wanted to meet with her directly at the warehouse to discuss a resolution. And when Sarah asked nervously if that meant the regional managers, Adam told her no. These were the actual majority shareholders of the entire corporation, flying in specifically to see her. The next morning, Adam arrived to pick her up himself, and as they pulled into the same lot where she'd once been fired in front of everyone, Sarah felt her stomach twist, the snow along the fence line untouched and bright under the gray winter sky, and Roger Blake's face went pale the moment he spotted her walking in beside Adam. A low rumbling sound grew overhead as they stepped inside, and through the office windows Sarah watched, stunned, as a private jet bearing the parent company's logo touched down on the open tarmac beside the warehouse, snow kicking up in a fine white cloud behind its wheels, and two executives stepped off it with serious expressions that made the whole loading dock go quiet. Inside the meeting room, long glass windows overlooking the snow-dusted lot behind them, the tension that had followed Sarah for weeks finally started to crack, the executives admitting plainly that firing her had been a serious mistake, that internal security footage showed no involvement from her in the missing inventory whatsoever, and that learning she'd saved one of their most important investors' lives made the failure even harder to justify. They apologized to her directly, promising a substantial settlement, and Sarah sat there trying to process all of it, gripping the edge of the table while Adam stood quietly beside her, his steady presence the only thing keeping her from feeling like the room was spinning entirely out of control. Mr. Hastings leaned forward and asked her plainly what she wanted out of the situation, whether it was money, her old job back, or something else entirely, and Sarah surprised even herself by saying she didn't want her old job back at all. She wanted to know that nobody else on that floor would ever be fired the way she had been, over a rumor nobody bothered to check. Hastings sat back at that, exchanging a glance with the other executive beside him, and said quietly that it was, in his experience, a rare thing for someone in her position to ask for a policy change instead of a bigger check, and that Brightpoint would be reviewing its entire termination process floor-wide starting that same week, with an outside auditor brought in to make sure no other worker was ever fired on nothing more than rumor and bad timing again. Just as things seemed to be settling into place, one of the shareholders, a sharp-featured man introduced as Mr. Hastings, cleared his throat and said there was still the matter of the actual thief, because someone inside that warehouse had been running the barcode scheme for months, and until they found the real culprit, the company's reputation would keep bleeding out in the press. Roger Blake's face went from pale to sweating almost instantly, mumbling something about needing to check his own records before anyone accused him of anything. And it was Adam, watching him closely, who quietly asked one of his own security consultants to pull the warehouse's badge access logs from the exact hours the missing shipments had gone out, a request that made Roger start stammering excuses nobody had asked for yet. Within 2 days, the truth came out in full. It hadn't been some low-level employee running the scheme at all. It had been Roger himself, using his manager credentials to override the barcode system and funnel high-value electronics out through a side door with a rotating crew of drivers who had no idea what they were actually hauling. A scheme he'd apparently been running for the better part of a year to cover gambling debts nobody at the warehouse had known about. When the news broke, Roger was arrested at the warehouse in front of the same employees who had once looked at Sarah like she was guilty of his crime, and Priya later told her over the phone, half laughing and half furious, that Roger had tried to claim he was just holding the merchandise for a friend right up until the officers walked him out to the squad car in full view of the entire loading dock. Something about watching the video Priya sent her, Roger being walked out in handcuffs while snow drifted quietly past the loading dock windows, gave Sarah a strange, hollow kind of peace she hadn't expected to feel, less like triumph and more like a held breath finally being let go after weeks of holding it without realizing. The story hit local news within days. A warehouse worker fired for helping a dying stranger, then vindicated when the real thief turned out to be the very manager who'd fired her, and Adam's role in exposing it only added to the frenzy. Reporters camping outside both the warehouse and, eventually, Sarah's small rented house. Cameras catching her simply trying to walk to the mailbox in the snow some mornings. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by all of it. Strangers online calling her a hero. People from her old high school reaching out after years of silence. A local news anchor even asking if she'd sit for an interview about faith and second chances. And in the middle of all that noise, the only thing that felt steady and real was the handful of quiet phone calls she and Adam kept having late in the evening. Conversations that had stopped being about the case a while ago. With the settlement money finally in her account, Sarah did something she'd wanted to do for years and enrolled in community college courses toward a nursing degree, something she'd given up on back when her mother first got sick, and Diane cried happy tears the day Sarah showed her the acceptance letter, holding it in both hands like it might disappear, snow falling softly outside their kitchen window like it had that very first night. Sarah told her mother that the whole reason she'd chosen nursing, back before life got in the way, was the memory of a nurse who'd once stayed late with Diane during a bad night at the hospital just to hold her hand, and that after everything with the crash and the ambulance ride, she couldn't stop thinking about how much it mattered to be the calm, steady person in somebody's worst moment. Priya threw her a small party at the diner near the warehouse when she heard the news. Just a handful of co-workers crowded into a corner booth with a grocery store cake and a card everyone had signed. Even a few people who'd stayed quiet during the whole ordeal. And it was the first time in months Sarah had felt like herself again instead of a headline other people kept arguing about. Just when it seemed like the hardest part was finally behind her, Sarah got a call from a reporter at a national outlet asking for comment on a rumor that Adam Sinclair's firm had orchestrated the entire rescue and lawsuit as a publicity stunt to boost his company's image after a string of bad press earlier that year. The accusation hit Sarah harder than she expected, not because she thought it was true, but because it made her second-guess every quiet, careful kindness Adam had shown her, wondering in her worst moments whether any of it had been about her at all, or whether she'd just been a convenient story for a man who needed one. The reporter read her a quote on the phone, supposedly from an anonymous source close to the deal, claiming that Adam's firm had known about the barcode scheme for weeks before the crash and had simply waited for a sympathetic face to attach to the story before going public. And Sarah felt sick hearing her own rescue described like it had been staged from the very beginning. Like the golf club and the broken glass and the blood on her hands had all been part of some script written by people she'd never met. She hung up without answering and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, staring at the phone, replaying every conversation she and Adam had shared, searching for some sign she'd missed that any of it had been calculated rather than real. And the longer she sat there, the colder the room seemed to get. She called Grant first, her voice tight, and he was honest with her, admitting that a rival investment group had been feeding that narrative to reporters because Adam's very public defense of a warehouse worker had embarrassed several of Brightpoint's other silent partners, men who preferred their labor disputes handled quietly and never in the headlines. Grant added that one of those partners, a board member who'd clashed with Mr. Hastings for years over control of the company, had reportedly called Adam's office twice that week demanding he distance himself from the story publicly, and that Adam had refused both times, telling his own legal team flatly that he wasn't going to let a woman who saved his life get thrown under a bus twice by the same industry. When Adam heard what was being said, he didn't call his lawyers first. He drove straight to Sarah's house through a thickening snowstorm, wipers barely keeping up with the flakes coming down. And when she opened the door, he simply said that whatever anyone else believed, she deserved to hear directly from him that none of what he'd done had ever been about optics. It had only ever been because she'd saved his life without asking who he was. Sarah stood in the doorway for a long moment, snow gathering on his shoulders and in his dark hair. and she admitted quietly that she was scared, not of the reporters, but of how much she'd started to care about someone whose whole world felt impossibly far from hers. A warehouse packer and a man who flew executives in on private jets. She told him she'd almost let herself believe the story the reporter told her, not because she wanted to, but because it would have been easier somehow, less terrifying, than admitting that she'd fallen for someone who could just as easily walk back into his own world one day and forget the version of himself that showed up on her porch in a snowstorm. Adam stepped inside out of the cold and told her that none of that had ever mattered to him, that the first thing he'd noticed about her wasn't her circumstances at all. It was the fact that she hadn't hesitated for a single second on that icy road when a stranger needed help. And that kind of instinct, he said, was rarer than any amount of money. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, the fear she'd been carrying since the reporter's call finally easing. And for a moment neither of them said anything else. The only sound the soft hiss of snow against the window and Diane quietly slipping into the kitchen to give them privacy neither of them had asked for, but both clearly needed, the kettle clicking on a beat later than it needed to. The rumors died down within the week once Brightpoint's own board publicly confirmed that Adam's involvement had been entirely personal, tied directly to the accident, and had nothing to do with any coordinated campaign. And the rival firm that had pushed the story quietly backed off once its own motives started drawing scrutiny from the very reporters it had been feeding all along. In the months that followed, Sarah kept up with her coursework while working part-time at a local clinic, and Adam made it a point to be there for the small things, driving her to exams when the roads were bad, shoveling the front walk before Diane could try and hurt herself doing it, sitting with Diane over coffee while Sarah studied late into winter evenings that no longer felt lonely the way they used to. One evening, as the season's first heavy snow blanketed the city in that particular hush that makes everything feel paused, Adam stood with Sarah on her porch and admitted, almost sheepishly, that he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say to her about a dozen times on the drive over and had forgotten every word of it the moment she opened the door. Sarah laughed, the sound easy and warm despite the cold, and told him he didn't need a rehearsed speech, that she'd figured out a while ago exactly how she felt about him, ever since the night he showed up in a snowstorm just to make sure she knew the truth, and Adam reached for her hand like he'd been waiting for permission he didn't actually need. He admitted, quietly enough that she almost missed it under the wind, that he'd spent most of his adult life keeping people at arm's length after watching his father's whole world get taken away over something that wasn't even true, and that some part of him had been half convinced he'd end up doing the same thing to anyone who got close, until the morning a stranger refused to walk past him on the ice. They stood there a while longer, snow settling quietly over the porch railing and the bare winter trees along the street, the streetlights haloed in soft white the way they'd been on the morning of the crash, though nothing about this moment felt like an accident at all. Two people who had started as a stranger in a wrecked car and the woman who refused to walk past him, now standing close enough that the distance between their two very different worlds didn't seem to matter anymore. Diane watched from the window with a warm mug in her hands, thinking that maybe her daughter had been right all along, that the world really did have a way of paying back kindness eventually, even when it took its time, even when it arrived wrapped in snow and uncertainty and a stranger's grateful, quiet gaze. If this story reminded you that a small act of courage can change the whole direction of someone's life, let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest. And don't forget to subscribe to Winter Veil so you never miss the next one, because there's always another story waiting quietly on the other side of the snow.